Well, hello, this is Pat Lynch, and you are listening and watching As the World Turns or Burns. With me, as always, is
Kieran O'Keefe,
Brendan Connell,
and behind the board, first timer. Who do we have?
My name's Lily. I'm doing the stuff today, so.
All right, she's doing the stuff. She's talented and modest. All right, so today what we wanted to talk about is polarization. Saw an article, I think, Kieran, you saw the same thing as well, but it was a Pew Research Center poll that just measured across, call it 20 countries, on how do you rate your fellow citizens in terms of that? Do you the percent of people that would that consider that there's a group of people in the country that are just morally bad, or just like that, just are they're totally against, and they measured like the U.S. obviously, but then across all these other countries, and the thing that stood out first and foremost was that we're number one. Yay. Okay. So we had the highest level of polarization defined by people that just see that a significant number of people just see the other side as being, just wrong, morally wrong, or whatever. And then you just look at, how it is across all the other countries, and it just makes the contrast even more significant. So that being kind of the pretext, question to both of you guys is kind of, how did we get here? I mean, what is it that that caused this? And I think, and I normally I'd go left to right, Kieran, but Brendan promised hot takes, and we never turn down a hot take. So we're going to start this one off with you, Brendan.
So I guess I'll get to the hot takes as I go, but I can think of like four answers that might explain the growing polarization in the United States, and also maybe why the U.S. is more polarized than other nations. Some of these are more convincing than others.
Right.
So the first one is maybe it's some sort of ideological divide. So there is a difference between ideological polarization and what's called effective polarization, which is what that Pew research was more measuring. So ideological polarization is just simply the American public and maybe perhaps our policymakers are increasingly moving to different ends of the spectrum, right? So you're getting people that are just way more extreme right in their policy views and policy solutions, way more people on the left. Effective polarization, though, is it's not just that I disagree with you, but I almost dehumanize the other side of the aisle, and I lack trust toward the other side of the aisle, and I don't even maybe view you as an American if you're just you're on the left and I'm on the right, or vice versa. So effective polarization we definitely have, but ideological polarization, it's unclear if that's even what's going on right now. I've seen some studies that show this. I've seen other studies that in fact show maybe the opposite, that there's actually a lot of commonalities between even people that say they're far right or far left. And I've even noticed it in the classroom where, we get students that are, conservative, middle of the aisle, to the left. And I do kind of notice it whenever we have these like debates and such over the economy or healthcare or whatever. There always is some like common ground. So I've always been skeptical of that affective polarization is the result of ideological polarization. Nevertheless, so the second explanation, probably the most common one I hear, is social media. And it's like not just social media, but also kind of, the Fox News, the MSNBC. And if that's where people are getting their news, then they're kind of like stuck in that echo chamber, and they're increasingly not just getting pushed to different sides of the aisle, but again, this is where this like distrust happens and kind of dehumanizing, the crazy people on the left or the fascist on the right. And there's an element of truth to that, certainly. And I think social media has been kind of like gasoline to the fire. The problem with that, though, with that explanation alone, is why is this just happening in the United States and not more so in other countries where social media is equally prevalent? Also, I think polarization precedes the real rise of social media. I think this was already starting to happen back when I was in high school and college, where there was things like Facebook and Instagram, but it wasn't anywhere near as big as it is now. So it's part of the answer, but maybe not fully the answer. I think the last two answers are probably the most interesting and I would say the most convincing. The third one is there's been increased sorting amongst American voters. And by that, what I mean is, first off, there's no liberal Republicans anymore, and there's no conservative Democrats.
Right.
And on top of that, there's like all these different divides in our country, urban, rural, religious, racial divides, and they're all mapping onto partisanship in the same way. And so it's increasingly causing this like tribal politics of all these people share my identity, all these people don't. I like them, I hate them.
Right.
So I think the more that voters are going to kind of sort themselves into all these different groups, and all these groups map on partisanship, I think that's, perhaps why we've got this affective polarization. The last one is really just like a study that I was reading earlier today, and it's making the claim that in the United States, at least, more like cultural issues have come to the front rather than purely like economic issues. And there's something about that gets people very angry toward the other side. Because when you talk about issues like abortion rights or education, like what we're teaching in schools, it almost becomes like an existential threat to people if they don't get their way or their policy preferences enacted in government. And so again, that just feeds kind of this us versus them mentality. So in short, I think it's a mix of all those things maybe. Right. And I don't know, I guess we could argue which of these is most important. I'm probably most convinced by the partisan sorting. Yeah. But I don't think there is a clear answer yet in the literature, at least where I come from in political science.
Yeah. Yeah. You don't see heated debates that over that the GDP went from 2.6 or 2.8. That's not going to get people's temperatures up, but it's all the cultural stuff. Yeah. That is definitely that hot button, which that's what always comes up in the elections too, all the politicians know that. I don't know, Kieran, thoughts?
Yeah, it's a big question. I don't think there's one answer for it either. I think just to build off of Brendan's last point, I remember reading something, it's probably a couple of years ago now, but what the author was arguing was that from like 1932, with the election between FDR and Herbert Hoover, up until 2016, the central issues in American politics were mostly economic-based in some form. Obviously, there are some exceptions, but the central issues in American politics were more economy-based, economics-based, rather than cultural identity-based. And that 2016 should be seen as like almost like a political realignment in the U.S., where the issues that we're arguing about radically changed. And so those issues that were began with like the New Deal and the Great Depression, no longer are sort of the axis around which our politics revolve. So I thought of that as Brendan was talking about sort of cultural issues being more heated than economic issues. So that, to me, I think there's probably some truth to that. I think you could probably trace the polarization in the U.S. some ways back maybe to the 80s and even the 90s. I think one maybe maybe overlooked factor at times is that if you look at that period between let's say like the 1930s up until the 1990s, up until 1991, there was always some kind of external adversary that I think it served as a way to sort of bring Americans together to an extent. So in World War II, that meant mobilizing against Germany, Japan, and Italy. During the Cold War, that meant to be an American was to not be a communist, and some sense of unity against the communist Soviet Union. And I'm not saying this is the major reason, the reason why, but I think once you kind of lack that clear external enemy, which you can contrast yourselves against, it became a little bit harder for Americans to sort of unify. Nothing unifies people like a good common enemy, I think, in some regards. So I think that's a contributing factor. I think social media plays a role in it, though it is fair to say that all countries have social media. And the cultural sorting thing, to me, I think is also true. But I guess the question then I'd have is, why are we culturally sorting? So it's definitely true. But why today are urban areas much more democratic than they were 30 years ago, and rural areas much more Republican than they were 30 years ago? Why is there's cultural sorting? I guess I wonder about the mechanisms behind that, and I don't know. I've mentioned before. I do think the primary process is harmful, and that came about in the 70s. I think that probably intensifies this polarization. We do have a two-party system, which makes us different than other countries, most other democracies at least. And I think you could make an argument that at certain points in American history, the two-party system has actually been good for depolarization because it has forced sort of large coalitions on both sides of the aisle, in a sense, to forces together, the Democratic Socialists in the same party as like the Joe Manchins, for example.
Yeah.
And on the right, you have the radical conservative evangelicals in the same party as people who just want lower taxes but are socially pretty moderate. But maybe in our current environment, just the way politics have evolved and the social media and all these other factors at play, maybe the two-party system has kind of done the opposite now, where it's been hijacked by extremists in both cases, and that has in some ways kind of helped facilitate further divides in our country in terms of polarization. Because I think if you're looking at like what makes the U.S. different, the two-party system is very different than most other democracies. It's probably not the only factor, but maybe that has something to do with it. But it's a big question. I don't really think I have a great answer to it, honestly. But it's definitely something that's developed over the last few decades.
Well, question for both of you: what role does Trump play in all of this?
He has to play a huge role, and he's such a divisive figure. I think if you get rid of Trump, the polarization predates Trump, but Trump certainly made it a lot worse. And if we get rid of Trump, maybe it's better. I don't know. Yeah. We'll find out in a few years. But for the...
Maybe.
Yeah. Constitutionally, we'll find out in 2029.
All right.
Unconstitutionally, I don't know. But it's definitely played a role in it for sure, because he is just an incredibly divisive figure. And I think what makes Trump a little bit different than a lot of other... There are plenty of divisive figures in U.S. history, but most divisive figures at least sort of say the things they have to say to kind of sort of appeal to the other side. Right. Trump has never made any real attempt to appeal to those who aren't on his side, and he's at the same time extremely reluctant to criticize anybody on his side, whatever that is. Anybody who supports him, whether it be like the Proud Boys, who he's very reluctant to criticize.
His side until they disagree.
Yeah. So Trump definitely doesn't help. I do not think he is the cause of it, but he's probably a facilitator of it.
Yeah. Brandon?
Yeah, no, he's not the root cause, but he's definitely something that has, I think, a cause of just how much this has accelerated over the past decade. I'm a believer that people's policy preferences are generally they're just trying to emulate kind of elites and what people are saying, whether it's people in the media or whether it's the president. Another stylized fact about public opinion is most voters actually don't have a policy attitude toward like most policies. Like the very important stuff, they've thought about it before. But when you talk about something like trade policy, before 2016, maybe even before 2024, like no one really had a strong opinion on trade policy. Most people didn't even know what tariffs were. Even if they did, they didn't fully understand the effects of tariffs on the economy. And now all of a sudden trade is this polarizing issue. So like, why did that happen? Did all of a sudden overnight, did voters start taking macro-econ classes? They did not. It really just became an issue at the top, and then it became part of the debate. And then the Trump tariffs happened at the beginning of his term, and now people really care about it, and now it's a super polarizing thing. And also what's confusing about it is Republicans used to be the pro-trade party, now they're the opposite. So like the only way you can explain these like weird flips and why something that wasn't important now all of a sudden is important and is super polarizing, it really is just the narratives that are kind of being fed from the media and the narratives and what's being said by people in government. And Trump is one of those people in government. And he's kind of pushed, American politics in this bad equilibrium where once one side starts kind of talking bad toward the other side, it leads to retaliation. And now it's like, I guess part of Biden's campaign going into 2024 was to try to be the maybe more civil candidate, and I'm going to defend democracy, and I'm going to play nice, but it didn't work. So, honestly, there's probably self-interested reasons if you want to get reelected to hop onto Trump's coattails and keep talking bad toward the other party, because that's how you could really garner that base.
Which kind of to wrap this up, where's this where's this headed? Is it going to accelerate, be static just at the current levels? Or is there any, with call 2029, that there's something that it might change and moderate, and so Americans become a little more trusting of the other side? I mean, what are you guys' thoughts?
I was gonna just the last thing Brendan said. Voters definitely take their cues from politicians. You definitely see that with Trump. And it's probably like a self-reinforcing thing in some ways. I think going back to the point I made earlier, that if you have political parties that are now taking more extreme positions because of the candidates, because of the voters who are selecting the candidates to then get into office who are more extreme, and then those politicians have more extreme positions, which then filters down to the voters and so on. So I think there's like probably a cycle there that plays a role in making polarization worse. I guess to answer your question, predictions are extremely difficult, and I think someday you can look back and there are going to be a lot of wrong predictions on this podcast. But I think until Trump leaves, there's no way it's going to get any better. It could get worse. It definitely won't get better. Once he's out, I don't know what's going to happen. I'd give it a shot that things can get better, because I think Trump has a very unique cult of personality around him, and that's going to be hard to replicate. It's hard to replace that. This is going back a ways. Think about someone like Stalin had a huge cult of personality around him. No other Soviet leader was able to replicate that. So it's not an easy thing to create. And once he is gone, maybe that changes things, and people begin, not just kind of reacting to whatever Trump is doing, like opposite if you don't like him and for him if you do like him. Maybe that will change things. But until Trump's out of the picture, I don't think anything's going to change substantially.
Yeah, I don't know if I have much to add. I'm not optimistic, though. I mean, it's not going to change in the next 3 years. Even when Trump leaves, I don't know. It just, like I said before, it feels like we're like stuck in a bad equilibrium of now that kind of sides have, started kind of breaking norms, and now that it's now kind of in vogue to just start calling the other side names. It's just let that cat out of the box, and I don't know if I see it changing until you start to maybe change the two-party system and change things like gerrymandering and make it so that maybe there's a little bit more incentives to cater to the moderate rather than cater to the far right or far left. But I
think that's one of the biggest problems right now is the incentives are all misaligned. The incentives in politics are just so messed up at the moment because, I mean, I've said this a million times, but if you're the politician's primary incentive is to get reelected. In most cases, that currently means appealing to the base. If you can change that, if you can change it so that their primary concern is to try to appeal to people more in the middle or a little bit on the other side, but not too far on the other side, I think you'd get very different behavior from politicians. You have to change the incentives. And there are other things we can do too, which maybe aren't polarization based necessarily, but be really popular. How about like banning stock trading for members of Congress? That probably polls at 95%, but it's not a law. There are people on both sides of the aisle who are opposed to that. That's not just one side or the other. I know Nancy Pelosi has defended it.
Yeah, Mark Wayne Mullen just got in the news.
Well, you get these people too who put like some absurd amount of money down hours before the U.S. attacks Iran.
Who would have thought?
On a prediction market. So they have some kind of inside knowledge. So there are those things we could do. But I think the next president in office really just needs to take a lot of reform, reform the system. So I still think gerrymandering, I've said many times, is probably the lowest hanging fruit because you can do it through legislation. I think other big constitutional changes would require an amendment, which is not going to happen. But if you can start with that and just sort of change the incentives, if you get the incentives aligned in a better way, politicians will behave better and you have a better political system. But as long as the incentives are aligned the way they are now, I'm not sure the pathway out of this.
Yeah. Anything else, Brendan?
Amen.
All right. Yeah. All right. Well, that's a perfect way to end. So thank you for listening, watching As the World Turns or Burns. We're going to be back with you with another episode real soon. I'm thinking it's going to be just this little thing called Iran. So just stay with us, and we'll be in front of you real soon. Thanks a lot. Bye.
This podcast is sponsored in part by Lyon College and KILT Studios. Thank you to Jonah Winter for the intro and outro music.